Croatia, went through kinds of experiences which most of us can scarcely imagine. And it was Bojana who said that Psalm 121 was the source of strength for her. That's the one I have selected tonight to read, reading from the New Revised Standard Version. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where will my help come? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. He will not let your foot be moved. He who keeps you will not slumber. He who keeps Israel will neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord will keep you from all evil. He will keep your life. The Lord will keep your going out and your coming in from this time on and forevermore. May God add his blessing to the reading and meditation on his word.
I know it has been the first day of summer, seems like. I was fortunate to be indoors in a place where the air conditioning worked. And I am also aware of the big thunderstorm that blew through town. There's always some excitement associated with those. And it looks like we might have another one pending. But I'm glad for those of you who have come this evening. It's always nice to look out on a congregation. Quite a few years ago, my attention was arrested by a story that I read of a minister who found himself in a predicament. He was, in fact, in danger of public embarrassment. His predicament had come upon him quite suddenly and unexpectedly, and as the experience unfolded, he realized that those around him were mildly amused at his expense. Perhaps you've noticed that when ministers are in a bit of a predicament, people tend to be interested in slightly above average manner. The trouble had come to this preacher in this way. He had been a guest speaker in a church away from his home. And as the church service ended, one of the families in the church invited him to come home to lunch, which he appreciated. And as they were going out from the church to the parking lot to their cars, all of a sudden, Penny, the daughter of that family, asked if she could ride home with the preacher. He, of course, consented. And very quickly, as they started on the road, the preacher found out that something was not right, at least not with Penny. She seemed to be very preoccupied, very deep in thought, very agitated, unwilling to engage in the kind of conversation that is usually so much a part of adolescence. And so there was little conversation on the way, little that is, until the car turned into the lane that led up to Penny's home. And then of a sudden, all that silent brooding produced effect. Penny launched into quite a tirade. She lit into her parents about how terrible they were. She criticized the school and the teachers she attended. She tore up the church and its people. She even had some uncharitable things to say about the preacher. And then as the car came to a stop in front of the house, with her whole family standing in the driveway preceding them, Penny threw open the door of the car, stepped triumphantly into the driveway, and yelled with a flair, "So, who needs religion anyway?" And then she stomped into the house. In one grand outburst, this young girl would sweep away all of religion, along with those who carried it into her life. To her, you see, religion had become a burden, an unwanted restriction upon her life, something with no purpose, with no relevance, something that was worse than useless. I understand that story caught my attention and resonated with me for at least a couple of reasons. First of all, I too am a preacher. And when I heard that story, I thought to myself, I want to make sure I avoid any such pickles if possible. But more than that, the story intrigued me because I have sensed in Penny's grand outburst something of the tenor of our times. How many there are today who resonate inwardly with Penny's sentiments, who feel that religion is a leftover anachronism, people who discredit it, who contend that it is for the weak-minded, for those who need some kind of psychological crutch. I have heard it reported that Carl Sagan, the modern science writer, once declared that religion was for those who have IQs of less than 100. And Don Feder, a newspaper columnist, reported some years ago an incident in which a friend of his had clipped from the newspaper a story about a Christian minister, a fundamentalist minister, who had publicly declared war on the Easter Bunny, the Easter Bunny being a pagan symbol in his mind. The friend, after taking the clipping out of the paper, sent Don the clipping with a handwritten notation, more proof that religion is essentially idiotic for the intellectual coward and the miserably humorless. I have read arguments that contend religion is for the uneducated, it's for intellectual cowards, for the psychologically dependent who, being weak of intellect and will, require some kind of big daddy in the sky. This very afternoon I tried an experiment. I typed the phrase "dangerous religion" into Google and was surprised that it took quite some time for the results to be manifest on my screen. I soon discovered why. 3.8 million hits with that phrase, two of which I will share with you. The first, I discovered a book by the atheist Sam Harris entitled "The End of Faith." It's a book that has been in the news not too long ago, in which this gentleman alleges that the very idea of God is both irrational and dangerous. Not just dangerous or irrational, but both irrational and dangerous. Then I found this quotation at a website called dangerousmadness.com. The quote says, "There is nothing like some of that old-time religion to cause a serious case of dangerous madness." Are you listening? "It is with this in mind that we bring you some of the most irrational, illogical, and of course dangerously mad examples of religion in action. No offense intended to the religious. Not all of you are dangerous, not all of you are mad. Are you comforted?" These are the sentiments that can very easily be found common in our society, vilifying Christianity, religion in general. Now, in looking at this phenomenon, we must be forthright enough to admit that this reaction against Christianity and other religions by modern man is not without cause or without reason. We must face the fact that religion is not without fault, that in some ways religion, Christianity included, is a funny business. A careful look into history will give you plenty of evidence to prove to you that religion has many wrongs to its account. Religion has fostered superstition. For how many generations were not people corralled by the fear of ghosts and hobgoblins and devils? Christianity has been known to hinder scientific investigation. You might think of Galileo to start with. There is a great tension in our day between Christianity and scientists. Christianity has kiboshed joy and fun. For how many years were the saints encouraged to come to church dressed in black to worship a God who is actually quite extravagant in the use of color? And how often were we to be somber in church while in heaven the angels sang with unspeakable joy? And for how long was it not suggested that if something brought pleasure and joy, it must be wrong? Religion has fostered insensitivity, engaged in persecution, at times using tortures that I would never describe from this pulpit. Wars have been fought in the name of God. And if you study history, it seems oftentimes that the religious wars seem to be the most vicious. It seems as if people conclude that if God is on my side, the devil must be on yours, or you must be on the devil's. And so if I destroy you, I end up doing God a favor. Religion has fostered such strange things as enforced celibacy, polygamy. It has also been a nest for hypocrisy. Religious faith has given rise to some magnificent and large, notable religious organizations that have sometimes inadvertently given power to people. And power has corrupted people, and those people have turned that power against the saints of God themselves. And it is true, religion places restrictions on people's lives and curbs their freedoms. I think of that one sect, I think of Hutterites. I hope I'm correct on this, where they were taught to shun worldly goods. And if you joined the society, you were given a small wooden box into which you had to be able to place all your worldly possessions, and it was a mark of distinction if you didn't fill the box up when you came. I think it was William James who wrote once that there can be no doubt that, as a matter of fact, a religious life exclusively pursued does tend to make a person exceptional and eccentric. Now, lest you misunderstand, that was not a compliment. He is saying that those who persist exclusively in matters of religion end up being somewhat eccentric. If you asked a college student today what that meant, they would probably use the word weird. Religion, theistic religion, monotheistic religion, Christianity itself has plenty of adversity registered to its account. With all these failings now widely known, with all the church's failings even in the news from day to day, you and I cannot lightly treat the outburst of young Penny. Modern man is taking in all the information, drawing conclusions, and those conclusions are causing him to push matters of faith to the periphery of life. I was surprised and touched to read the opinion of Elton Trueblood, the Mennonite scholar, a great man, sadly no longer alive. But he observed a few years ago that it is hard to exaggerate the degree to which the modern church is irrelevant to modern men. The church is looked upon as something to be neither fought nor seriously defended. As I thought about that this afternoon, apathy must be the worst of treatments. If somebody loves you and appreciates you, then some action ensues. If they dislike you, some action ensues. But to be treated with apathy is really to be forced into irrelevant existence, marginalized existence. Modern man, when confronted by the question, who needs religion anyway, is responding, not I, or at least that's what he thinks he's responding. But friends, before you or I are tempted to walk far down that road, we ought to stop long enough to observe that men and women are actually hopelessly religious. If you look out upon the vast scope of human experience, you will discover it is a fact that human beings are hopelessly religious. We, all of us, have a capacity to worship that we invariably exercise. You will not find any person without a God. You will find no society without its religion. Now, it may not be Christianity or Islam or Hinduism. It may be something more undefined, like materialism or patriotism or communism. Or I would even argue that atheism itself is a form of religion. Whatever you find, every man and every woman has a God. Every human being has an object of worship. And I suppose there are a number of reasons for this, but one significant one is that we somehow know intuitively that we are mortal, that we are temporary beings, that we are small and puny. We understand that life is transitory, that we live with only partial knowledge. And we sense, therefore, instinctively that if we are to make sense of our lives, we will have to reach out beyond ourselves. We will have to connect ourselves to something that is out beyond us, something that is not subject to the same kind of transitoriness that we suffer from. It was to this point that Pastor Calvin Thompson, in an article in Insight magazine some years ago, pointed. And he pointed out that in order to make sense of life, we reach out to something beyond ourselves, to something grander and more permanent, and then having found it, we bring it into the center of our lives and we make it the object of our worship. And he continues, that's why faith in God is so important. The only real way to live one's life with dignity and courage is to live on the basis of something eternal, permanent, and transcendent. And John Noss, in a book called Man's Religion, said that all religions imply that man does not and cannot stand alone, but is vitally related with and even dependent on powers external to himself. See, our sense of permanence in our own lives is so marginal that we have to link ourselves to something outside our own existence, thereby finding relevance and meaning. And so it is that the things we find beyond ourselves prove vital to our well-being. They form the center of our existences. They form the point around which we orient life. And by doing so, we discover personhood and purpose and permanence. And we discover perspectives for living. And let me observe then that it is precisely the religion you or I adopt that sets the parameters or boundaries for our lives, that allow us to have a defined space for living and thus a sense of identity and a sense of personhood. I remember reading once about a man who set out to sail around the world by himself. Not a feat for the faint-hearted, by the way. And in his article he wrote how at one point he was sailing across the Pacific all alone, and he entered that region of the planet known as the doldrums. He had the misfortune of being there for way longer than he had anticipated. And rather than succumbing to the boredom and wasting his time, he decided to put his time to some use. He noticed that the barnacles had been growing on the hull of his little sailboat. And so he decided he'd get off and scrape them. And so, attaching a tether to himself, he jumped into the ocean and began the task of scraping off the barnacles. After he'd been out there about 15 minutes, he said in the article that he quit. He couldn't do it anymore. That he swam back to the ladder at the back of his boat and he climbed up and he sat within the confines of his vessel. And you ask, why had he quit so soon? I was interested in his explanation. He said that as he was there floating in the great Pacific, scraping the barnacles, he began to think about how deep the ocean was, at that point some 5,000 feet. And he began to think how there was no land for 1,500 miles in this direction or 2,000 in that direction, and north and south there was nothing but open ocean. And he began to feel like he was in a place that was too big for him. He felt too insignificant. He felt vulnerable. He didn't know what kind of denizens dwelt in the deep. Actually, he did know. But he felt so small and so insignificant in the vast ocean that he became unnerved. He lost his sense of identity and personhood, and he climbed back into his boat. And it was only as he sat there, with space defined around him, that he began to feel safe and human again. His boat provided him with a cocoon on the vast ocean in which he could live and have his being. And that, friend, is what religion does for you in life and does for me. It gives us a nest. It gives us a place of safety in which to live. It sets the parameters for our living. And those parameters give us destiny, give us identity, and allow us to have a sense of personhood. Without a system of belief, you'll be hard-pressed to have a sense of personhood in space. And religious faith also gives us a sense of permanence. In this life, everything seems transitory. Everything we have or touch or buy seems to have a beginning and an end. We need some fixed point of reference that will give us more permanence. Some years ago, I stumbled across a very interesting story written by a reporter during the Second World War. The story intrigued me because in this piece of writing, he openly confessed how, as a reporter, he had become quite unnerved by the tumult of the war. And you remember 1941, the war wasn't going so well for the Allies. And day after day he would read these reports, he would write some of these reports, he would read the news coming off of the wire, and he became very unnerved. And one day, as he was walking down the city street, the doors of a church were open, and he impulsively went in. First time he'd been in a church for 22 years. And afterward he wrote the following. He said, 6 months ago I scoffed at the churches. And then one day on a sudden whim I attended a service. Since then I have been going steadily. First out of curiosity, but lately out of rising excitement. I have found out, he said, that churches today are dispensing something that I need. And what was the church dispensing? It was dispensing a sense of permanence. While newspapers spoke of destruction and devastation, the church spoke of God, who presides over eternity. The reporter went on to write, I found that I was acutely interested in hearing about anything that had permanence, beauty, and unselfish endeavor. It fell on my spirit like water on a desert, and I went out stirred and grateful. Here was a man with no sense of permanence, no sense of security. A godless life had left him naked, exposed. The war had shattered even the appearance of security that he was enjoying. But he made a great discovery in the realm of religion, that religious faith can give you a sense of grandeur and permanence. How wonderful it is every day when I get up for me to realize that whatever happens today, there is a God who presides over eternity. A wonderful truth. And religion can also give a sense of purpose to our living. I am intrigued by how many young people today periodically come by my office to talk about what to do with life. I don't know if it's ever been an easy decision, but it seems that it may be particularly challenging today, given the many varied options that are available to both men and women. And the thought occurs to me that those who have religion, who have faith, have a decided advantage in the selection of a life, of what to do with a life. I know a woman who, when she was young, confessed that she had little direction or purpose in life. She had gone to academy, she'd finished that, went to college. She ambled around the college campus, wandering back and forth from one class to another, wondering what to do. She had some thoughts sometimes of being a nurse, but then she thought she wouldn't be. She lived with no sense of direction, and one day, as a result of some religious endeavors on that campus, she asked God into her life. She acknowledged the claims the Creator had on her person. And she said, I heard with my own ears, she told how that very evening when she returned to her room, she found herself overtaken by peace and joy. And it wasn't very long after that she realized that her newfound faith had done something else for her. It had given her a sense of purpose. You see, she could now see her place better in the grand scheme of things. She would indeed become a nurse. She would spend her life ministering to the sick and the suffering and the dying, but she would do it with a superior motive, not an ulterior one, a superior one. She would do it in the name of Christ. That would not just be a job to her. It would be a calling. And I was interested to know that she pursued that calling for many, many years. She became finally a teacher of nurses. She is retired today. If she were to stand here, she would tell you with considerable joy of the great fulfillment that came from fulfilling that sense of purpose that was born at the point of her commitment to Christ. And not only does religion give identity and permanence and purpose, I think it also gives us a sense of perspective that makes life valuable. By allowing us to have a sense beyond the present, it can enable us to make sense out of nonsense and even to see triumph in the midst of tragedy. I remember well how years ago now, my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, passed away. He was a grand old man. He was 88 when he died. He had spent some 60 years, he and his wife, my grandmother, as missionaries in Africa. He was a man of great integrity. He was a man of good character and spirituality. He was also meticulous. One of the memories I have of him is that whenever he went on a trip, he would keep the record of his gas consumption and the miles traveled meticulously. And when he was done, he would calculate his gas mileage to 2 decimal points. I found somebody today who does it to 3. So anyway, that's how it is in life. But grandfather passed away. His was the first death that actually came close to my place of living. And though the emotional pain of his passing is long ago diminished, I still miss him, and I remember how it was for quite some time after he died, very difficult to be in places that were familiar to him and find him not there. And so our family gathered in Washington, D.C. for the funeral. We endured our time of grief. And if you have ever grieved a loved one, you understand the dynamic of that. But that time of grief was interesting, in that I saw, as I had never seen before, religion giving perspective to living. I saw it first in the life of my father on one of those numberless trips to care for all the details that surround such events. He confessed to us how hard it was for him to see his father decline. For 88 years, my grandfather had been in hospital only once in his whole life, and that was at the age of 70. To see him succumb by small degrees had been almost unbearable for my dad. But in those difficult hours, I saw religion at work, because my father also confessed that in the midst of the pain and loss, he realized as never before the value of his faith. For it had given him a perspective that allowed him to see beyond the grave to a greater triumph. I saw religion give perspective to my grandmother too. As she stood by the casket at the grave, she looked back on a marriage of 63 years. And her loss was acute, her sense of grief was immense, but she was serene. And I have noticed that there can be a certain serenity in the midst of great grief. And there came the moment to leave the casket, and I saw with my own eyes how she reached out and she put her hand on the casket and she patted it, and I heard her say, "I'll see you in the morning, Freddie." And into my own numbness there came a sense of astonishment. How could she do that? How could she say that? And then it struck me. She could do it because her religion had given to her a perspective that allowed her to see that there is a God who inhabits eternity, and what is now is not always what will be. And her loss, though keen, was temporary. She knew that God was at work toward the day when all that is wrong will be made right. You see, friend, religion gives you that kind of perspective that enables you to find triumph after tragedy, that enables you to make sense out of nonsense, that enables you to live with courage and perseverance through the ups and downs of our lives. And I want to contend in your presence this evening that the religion of the Bible is to be preferred above others. For it did not come by the devisings of humankind. It was not simply compiled by a bunch of scribes and scholars. It was not a collection of merely historical writings. It is the story of God's actions within human history. It is in that sense a revelation from God. Holy men of God spoke as they were moved by the Holy Spirit. They did not put together cunningly invented fables. They set down the activities of God in history for our instruction and admonition. And friend, you can hitch your wagon to that star. And if you do, it will give you identity and permanence and purpose and perspective. Way back in 1990, the Barna Research Group published a report stating its findings that the influence of the church was diminished greatly. Said that report, people for the most part see the church as an outdated institution with little to offer to the contemporary person. In the face of that, may I recite to you the words of A.N. Whitehead, where he said that the fact of a religious vision is our one ground for optimism. Apart from it, human life is a flash of occasional enjoyments, lighting up a mass of pain and misery. And so I ask you this evening, who needs religion anyway? May God grant us all an understanding at the profoundest level of our existence. We do.